Good morning.
Morning.
Good to see you all this morning. As you know, the governor called us, the legislature, into session to address two very troubling issues. One of them is the rise in violent crime in New Mexico, and the other one is our budget deficit that we're facing. And the House literally worked through the night. We've been up, we took about an hour off about an hour ago, but otherwise we worked through the night on that. And some of the results were we did protect essential government functions. We reversed the Senate cuts to CYFD and DPS, and we protected the sexual assault prevention programs and the victim services are very important to New Mexico. We also stopped the Senate's removal of $25 million of school reserves. That bill was stopped so they would not go forward. And we were able to do all this without raising taxes on the citizens of New Mexico, which we consider that very important. We also had legislation to bring justice to victims of violence through the death penalty bill. And so that was on the floor last night, and we were able to get that through, and which was something very near and dear to our hearts and very important to the people of New Mexico. The House worked hard to address the concerns of New Mexico, and it's now up to the Senate to move these measures forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to Majority Leader Gentry to say a few words.
Thank you, Speaker, for your leadership, and good morning to everybody. You know, we're all tired, but pleased with the outcome. Just a little bit about process. You know, the Senate passed their bills very quickly through the Senate. They did not have time for adequate review by the public. When we got the bills, there were some very significant changes we needed to make. As the Speaker referenced, the first was, you know, holding harmless Children's Youth and Family Department, which investigates and prevents abuse against children. Also holding harmless the Department of Public Safety, which prosecutes criminals. We also reversed $31 million in cuts made by the Senate through K through 12 education. So it was time well spent. We also passed three very important public safety bills that the Speaker referenced. The first was 3 strikes, which adds a mandatory life sentence for someone convicted of 3 violent felonies. We also passed the Baby Brianna's expansion bill, which provides a life imprisonment for anyone who is convicted of child abuse resulting in death. And finally, we passed a bill that would reinstate the death penalty for individuals convicted of murdering children, law enforcement, or correctional officers. Now, as the Speaker mentioned, we did all those things without raising taxes on New Mexico families. We spent a great deal of time identifying where we could achieve cuts to state government. We turned over just about every cushion in state government and identified, you know, cuts throughout state government. We also identified, you know, fund balances in various funds throughout the state that we could then use to fund state government. So again, it was time well spent, and we did all these things without raising taxes. I'd like to turn it over now to Dennis Roch, a member of the Appropriations Committee, to talk a little bit more about the budget aspect and what all we did to achieve the savings to state government. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader and Mr. Speaker. You know, I really want to talk a little bit about the process of how the committees really worked as a team to put this information together and bring us to where we are. There's a lot of folks that had said, oh my goodness, you know, there wasn't time for public input. We heard some complaints like that around the death penalty discussion, but I'll tell you, there were 2 full committee hearings on the death penalty alone, both of which featured public testimony, folks coming to the Capitol to tell legislators exactly what they thought, share their stories, share their feelings one way or the other, and that's what the committee process is all about. And it takes time to do those kinds of hearings and to grant access to the public, which is what the legislative process is supposed to be all about. On the budget, I would say the same thing, that we had lots of hearings, lots of input. One of the things that I said late last night or early this morning in talking to some of my colleagues about the budget proposals was that we didn't do these cuts to agencies. We actually worked with agencies over and over and over, where we brought the agency heads in, had conversations, asked them to help us identify some areas where there's excess cash in fund balances that could be swept to help solve the budget hole. In addition, the Appropriations Committee, on which I serve, actually had a full hearing over the possible the budget reduction bill, Senate Bill 9. There was an amendment offered, and folks had more than 24 hours notice before the final bill was brought to the House floor. In addition, we had a similar hearing on fund balance sweeps, and we actually presented a proposal, again, more than 24 hours notice for folks to digest it, have a chance to look at what proposed cuts there were and fund balance sweeps there were, and then when we finally did it on the House floor, there should have been no secrets, and that was exactly what we intended. And it's a little unfortunate that we were still accused of transparency issues and trying to hide the ball when, by contrast, the Senate passed all of their measures, their measures in about 12 hours. And so we went above and beyond. The committee process worked. It really represents a team effort. We're delighted to be able to get to this point, and we sure hope that the Senate will concur in our changes. Mr. Speaker?
That's pretty well where we're at. We're waiting for the Senate to come back to where we can officially turn the bills over to them and let them wrap them up so that we can all go on doing the business of New Mexico. So, if you have questions, we'd be glad to ask.
What are your expectations as these bills go back, both for the violent crime bills and for the budget? Are you expecting big changes from the Senate?
We should have changes. We feel that the budget bill are very acceptable, and we should see the Senate concur with those. We hope the Senate will take the crime bills and take them seriously and assign them to committee and work on them, and let's move them along and for the good of New Mexico.
And obviously it took quite a bit of time to get everything hammered out. Was there discussion with Senate members specifically on the budget ahead of time?
We had some ahead of time, but problem the last 3 days they weren't around. So it was real hard to reach final conclusion under those circumstances. But we hope we can work through that. So.
And obviously, this is day 6 now with a special session. I know going in, you had hoped it would only be 2 or 3 days. I mean, what do you say to folks who are concerned about, the costs incurred by being up here for 6 days?
Well, the cost may have cost a little more, but it's so important that we got the job done. The Senate lightened the load a little bit. They were gone, and since the signing died at that point, it kind of stops the revenue flow that way, so it lowers the cost of the session. But whatever the cost, it is very important that we get it done for New Mexico. Representative, you want to say something?
So the tobacco sweeps, which is the one part of it that you need to balance 2016, what do you expect to happen with that bill? And why is the one thing that everybody agreed on, why hasn't that passed all chambers yet?
Well, as the speaker alluded to, I mean, we spent time, 6 days, making sure that all these bills were fully vetted in the committee process, allowing people to come up and participate. Many of the bills were referred to 2 committees. The Senate bills were referred to 1 committee. All their budget bills were referred to 1 committee. So it took some time, but we feel that there's great value in vetting these bills closely and making sure that the public has a chance to input. But another point on your question, Dan, we spent 6 days. The Senate will have spent 3, but that amounted to about $100,000. But during that time, as I stated earlier, that resulted in the savings in K through 12 of about $31 million. We saved about $3 million from DPS and CYFD. So when you're able to realize cost savings to those type of agencies and minimizing cuts to core government functions, I think it's the people view that as a value.
So have there been conversations with the Senate on the budget solvency bills, especially?
Absolutely. More recently, we sat down with John Arthur Smith and Stuart Ingle, the minority leader in the Senate, and this is a product of compromise. I'd say all these bills are a product of compromise. We sat down with them several times, but this is an area where we cannot fail. Gridlock cannot prevail, because if this were to drag on and we were unable to come to an agreement, and if the Senate were not to concur with our amendments, I'm hopeful they will, then we just don't have the money to pay for state government. So really failure is not an option. I think people are tired of seeing gridlock in government, and we wanted to make sure that we got these budget bills done and back over to the Senate in a form that they could accept.
Representative Roch, question for you. I know over in Senate Finance, I was there when that cash balance bill came up. Stan Rounds at least indicated that the superintendents had no problem with that bill at the time. What changed from when that bill passed in the Senate to when it moved over to the House?
Well, if you actually look at what the Superintendents Association requested, they requested that if you're gonna make cuts to public education, initially the proposal was take some out of SEG, take some out of categorical, which is instructional materials, transportation, and take some out of below-the-line targeted reforms, and allow districts to keep their cash to have the flexibility to backfill when those cuts start taking effect. Ultimately, though, when the Senate came up with their proposal, they kind of had the superintendents over a barrel. And when we talked to superintendents from around the state, not just the association head, but all superintendents across New Mexico, we got a lot of the message of, gosh, we sort of were forced to accede to the Senate's demand, and we had to give. They kind of had us over a barrel. So their preference from the very beginning was no cash balance hits, because it allows the districts to get through tough times. And it didn't, by not sweeping those funds, it doesn't penalize those districts that responsibly planned ahead. They saw the revenue forecast just like we did. They saw the state's fiscal condition worsening and said, boy, we better plan ahead to make sure that we've got some dollars saved away for the tough times.
This could be for Representative Roch or anyone else. A recent journal poll found that a majority of New Mexicans think a balanced approach, even some tax increases, are appropriate for balancing this issue. Is this solution that you guys are ultimately going to send to the governor's desk a balanced approach?
Thanks, Alex. We believe it is. And what the fundamental difference between the Senate plan and our plan was that they proposed raising taxes on New Mexico families and New Mexico small businesses. And we believe that we could balance the state budget by making government more efficient. And as I said, we didn't pass any tax increases. We looked everywhere we could for additional funds. We swept, we swapped, we reauthorized and deauthorized, and through doing that, we were able to come out at a bottom line number identical to the Senate's without raising taxes.
What about, just another quick budget question. It seemed like the higher ed cuts were something that a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle had some heartburn about. And you eventually lowered your proposal a few times down to, I think, 5%. Was that, how hard of a push was that? And do you think that, the solvency package passed will, do the job for 17, or do you expect more in January?
We hope so. We'll be back in 3 months for the regular session, Dan. But, we did fill the hole with a little bit of reserves. Is it the amount of reserves we hope for? I don't think anyone will say that it is, but we addressed the current budget hole, and we're hopeful that'll see us through January, and then we'll be able to address it more comprehensively during a 60-day session.
Does the sweep bill and appropriation cuts have to come back to the House to pass with the super majority for them to become effective immediately?
For immediately, but in speaking with David Abbey, the legislative finance director, he believes that it's not a necessity, but I think we should be fine even without the one emergency clause on the sweeps bill.
You mentioned those reserves. If those reserves do drop to a level where it looks like they may, are you concerned about the bond rating at all?
I think that the bond rating is an issue. We'll be watching that closely, and again, we'll be back in session in 3 months. So, all right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.